One day, this guy Roberto, he's on a flight, and the plane is flying over the mountains. And suddenly, boom, the plane clips one of the mountain peaks, and the tail of the plane falls off. Then the rest of the plane, bam, crashes into a snow-covered mountain, and it slides down all the way until it finally stops. Now Roberto, he's still alive, but then he looks and he notices the nightmare around him. The other passengers are scattered all over the plane, they're bleeding and screaming in pain, and the entire back of the plane is missing. So now all the survivors are stranded in the middle of nowhere on a snow-covered mountain surrounded by glaciers. And they're in sub-zero temperatures, and it's hard to breathe because of the altitude. And to make it worse, the plane's power source was in the back. So there's now no way to power the radios to call the outside world to help. And of the 45 people on the plane, only 33 survived the crash. So Roberto and the other 32 passengers are just stuck there. So now what are they gonna do? Well, first, the group scrounges for food and any supplies they can find in the wreckage. And they huddle together to survive, hoping that rescue teams soon show up. That night, the temperature drops and it gets as low as negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit, which in Celsius is, I don't know because I'm American, but it's really fucking cold. But anyway, everyone ends up sleeping inside the only shelter they have, the plane wreckage. And that first night, 5 of them don't survive. So now they're down to 28 people. Now aside from the cold, they have another problem. They don't really have any food. And they end up searching through all the luggage, looking for anything, and they find a little bit. Some candy bars, a can of mussels, some jars of jam, but that's about it. So this is all they have to feed 28 starving people. So they start rationing it. And luckily, one of the passengers finds a transistor radio and he manages to get it working. And through that radio, they can hear news reports about their plane going missing and how there's rescue teams out looking for them. And suddenly, the passengers are overjoyed. I mean, it's only a matter of time before someone finds them. So they're out there for about a week, waiting to be rescued. And then, of course, they run into another problem. That small bit of food they were rationing runs out. Oh, and that's not even the worst part. Through that transistor radio, they get a news update. That rescue team that's been looking for them for over a week, they can't find them. So it's now assumed that Roberto and all the passengers on this flight are dead. And because of that, the rescue mission has been called off. No one is coming to save them. So there they are, stuck on a mountain in sub-zero temperatures with no one coming to save them, and they have nothing to eat. Until at some point, Roberto is basically like, well, there is one thing we could eat. He suggests that they eat the bodies of the other dead passengers. And at first, people are like, oh, gross, no way, we could never do that. But Roberto, he's like, I'm just gonna try one little bite. And he does, and it's horrible, and it's humiliating, but hey, it's food. And soon enough, the rest of the passengers get on board. And pretty quickly, eating people becomes part of the group's daily life. But whatever, finally, the group is no longer starving, and that gives them a little bit of hope. Until again. At this point, they've been stuck on this mountain for 17 days. And one night, they're all sleeping. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, a huge avalanche comes down. And it immediately kills 8 of them, and it buries the rest of them inside the plane wreckage. So now, there's only around 19 or 20 passengers left. Those remaining passengers are trapped in that plane wreckage for about 3 days before they're finally able to dig themselves out. And over the next month, they're still out there stuck on this mountain. And over that time, they lose 3 more people. But after these last few passenger deaths, Roberto has finally decided he's had enough. They've been stuck out there for 2 months, and Roberto's like, man, we are gonna die if we stay out here. And it's super risky, but they decide to climb off the mountain and find help. So he and 2 other guys pack a bunch of rugby socks with human meat to take with them, and they set off on this expedition to find civilization. They have no climbing gear, no compass, and they're up to their waist in snow. Regardless, they're gonna try and make it work, and they hike for 3 days before one of the guys finally turns back, and he leaves his food rations for the other 2. So Roberto and the other survivor, they hike in the snow for another week. And then they see a river, and they follow it down for a while, and then they start to see grass, and eventually some cows. Then they spot a couple of local ranchers on horseback, and one of the ranchers had heard about the plane crash, because at this point the story had been all over the news. And that rancher doesn't have a phone. He lives in the middle of nowhere. But he gets on his horse, and he rides 10 hours to the nearest town to go get help. And soon, finally, after 72 days of being stuck on that mountain, mountain. Helicopters show up to the mountain to rescue the remaining passengers. And you guys already know this story. They made like 3 movies about it and like 100 documentaries. Anyway, shout out to the Andes. So one night, this couple's at home eating dinner and they have a friend over. And suddenly, boom, the door gets kicked in and there's 2 men standing there with guns drawn. So the husband, we'll call him Pete. And the wife, her name's Francine. Now, Pete and Francine, they're not wealthy or anything. They're just a couple of working actors. And they have no idea who these 2 men are or why they targeted them. Now the men, we'll just call them the brothers. Now the brothers run toward them with their pew-pews out. And they're screaming orders at them. Get up! Then the brothers grab them, Pete, Francine, and their friend, who we'll just call Friend. And the brothers grab the 3 of them and they drag them all upstairs to the bedroom. And then they hold them at gunpoint. And one by one, they tie them up. Then one of the brothers goes back downstairs and he starts sifting through Pete and Francine's stuff. And then he loots their house and he loads all their valuables into Pete and Francine's car. Meanwhile, upstairs, the other brother has all 3 of them tied up and he's holding them at gunpoint. While Francine is trying to talk to the guy like, hey, please don't do this. And secretly, she's low-key trying to memorize his facial features just in case she makes it out of this alive. Then the brother goes over to Francine and he holds her down while he's still got a pew-pew to her head. And then he gets on top of her and he does something to her that I won't elaborate on, but starts with an R. And then when he's done, he goes over and does the same thing to her friend. All while Francine's husband Pete is there in the room and he's forced to witness the whole thing. And when they're done, the brothers get in Pete and Francine's car and they drive away. And Pete and Francine and Friend, they're absolutely horrified by what just happened. So they immediately go to police and they tell them everything. And luckily, Francine had memorized the attacker's face. So she helps police create one of those police sketches of the guy. But unfortunately, that sketch is all they have to go on. Regardless, police go out and they look for the brothers. But after a few days, it's kind of a dead end and they got nothing. But then, one night, an officer's out on patrol, and he sees a car that he finds suspicious. I'm not sure why. But he goes and pulls the car over just before it can enter the freeway and get away. So the officer walks up to the car, and he looks at the guy in the passenger seat, and he thinks, hey, that guy looks familiar. In fact, he looks just like the police sketch that Francine had helped them with. An officer realizes that it's one of the brothers, and bam, he arrests him right there. So Pete and Francine, they get the call, and then they go down to the police station to confirm that they got the right guy. And when they get there, they see there are already a ton of witnesses there ready to identify the brothers for other crimes they had committed. So the brothers get charged, they go to trial. The one that did the R word gets 2 life sentences. The other brother who looted their house, he gets less prison time, but still a lot of time. And poor Pete and Francine, they get years and years of therapy to help them recover from this horrible experience. But that is not actually the craziest part of Pete and Francine's story. Remember how I said they're working actors? Years later, Pete and Francine go on to create a television show. Completely unrelated to the robbery. But they create a show, and she acts in it, and he produces it. And that show becomes massively successful in the 90s. Because Pete is actually Peter Mark Jacobson, and Francine is actually Fran Drescher. And that show they created is The Nanny. It becomes one of the most popular sitcoms of all time. Also, much later, Francine actually goes on to become president of the Screen Actors Guild. It's pretty cool. And the sitcom has nothing to do with them getting robbed or whatever. It's just an interesting story. Anyway, shout out to New York.